I'm not sure how many of you will be or have been fans of the movie Braveheart. But if you're not, you should probably watch that movie. It ties into my next story. It's the story about a clan who were resisting the English for very good reasons. They lived in a little protected valley that was fed by 3 rivers and surrounded by 3, well, I wouldn't call them mountains, but very big hills. And the little valley was called Glen Coe. And it's a very interesting movie. The editors took a little bit of license here and there, but basically the story of Braveheart is true. Once the battle was over and the massacre was finished, those few who had managed to escape to the mountains and survive were made, I'm not sure exactly the word that should be used, non-people, non-entities. Their name was stripped. It was no longer legal to use their last name. So many of them took a different name. And, well, all of them took a different name. Many of them took the last name Coe, C-O-E. And some of them managed to escape and make it to safe haven in the Netherlands, or get on ships and come to America, or get to Canada. A lot of them, those who were captured and not killed, who were chased down in the mountains and captured, were sent as indentured servants, more or less slaves, for 7 to 12 years to the Americas to be used as slave labor. And the ancestors of the Coe brothers were supposedly among those who were sent to the American colonies as indentured servants. Now, if you leave the ranch here, the homesteads here, and follow Little Creek, about 12 miles down, Little Creek feeds into Eagle Creek. And 3 or 4 miles past that, Eagle Creek feeds into the Rio Hondo. Well, I believe that's where the Rio Ruidoso actually becomes the Rio Hondo, because the Ruidoso River comes down, Eagle Creek flows into it, and then Bonita Creek flows into it not more than a mile or so further down the river. And this little valley, the beginning of the Rio Hondo, is surrounded on 3 sides by steep hills. I won't call them mountains, but some people do. And the name of this little valley is Glencoe. Not Glencoe as in Scotland, but one word, Glencoe. And this is where the Coe brothers, one of them was named Frank, and I cannot remember what the other's name was now, originally built their homestead and then their ranch. The 2 of them together. And as I told you earlier, one time they found William Bonney wandering around with a lame horse and hungry and thirsty, and took him in, and he became a hand around their ranch for a while until he went on to greener pastures. But they always maintained a relationship with Billy the Kid. And, of course, when the Breeses moved in, and especially with a son-in-law named Peebles, another Scot, they were on pretty friendly terms. Now, right after the Lincoln County War, the Coe brothers had been told to get out and stay out, or they would suffer the same fate as Billy the Kid. And they left for a number of years, but when things settled down, they came back into the neighborhood and became very good friends with our family. As a matter of fact, when I was a senior in high school. Wilbur Coe, who was the grandson of Frank Coe, was writing a book. I think it's called Ranch on the Hondo or something like that. You can look it up. Wilbur Coe only wrote one book, and that's the one I'm talking about. But I remember when he was editing it, he would come up, on a Friday evening, and he and my grandmother would sit at the dining room table and go through the book. And my grandmother would say, Wilbur, you can't use that name. You've got to change it or indicate who that is some other way, because they they have grandchildren and great grandchildren who still live here, and they might not appreciate those names being mentioned in your book. Or she would say, Wilbur, do you think anybody is really going to believe you when they say that? I know that story is true. I've heard it myself. But maybe you better not state it in quite so strong a term as fact. It doesn't match with the history that's been put out there. Anyway, they went through the whole book and edited the entire book, made sure that it was as honest as could be without causing embarrassment to any of the descendants of the people mentioned in the book that still lived in the neighborhood. Because Wilbur tried to tell the story of the Lincoln County War and the experience of his family as honestly as he could from the stories that he heard growing up. Now, Wilbur at that time was about the same age as my grandmother, so at that time he was in his late 60s, early 70s, and is long gone now. I found his book very interesting. Some of the stories that were there I certainly had heard. Others I had not. But at any rate, the Coe family and ours were very, very close. As a matter of fact, the Coe family married into the Bonnell family, and my parents were playing cards with the Bonnells the the night my mother went into labor to have me. So, I mean, very, very close for a number of generations. But the Coes were bitter, bitter enemies with Murphy and Dolan. And my family, being friends of the Coes and also not too fond of Murphy and Dolan, pretty much walked on eggshells, trying to keep the peace without losing their dignity, I guess is the easiest way to say it. So I'm not sure exactly what happened, but Aunt Lyda told me in the late 1890s, a party of gentlemen from the county seat showed up on Benjamin Lewis's doorstep. And they basically told him, we know that you rode with the regulators, and that makes you an outlaw. So we're telling you right now, sell up and get out. Leave the county and don't come back, or you will suffer the same fate as Billy the Kid. So Benjamin Lewis, not really willing to rock the boat and fight the powers that be, loaded up their stuff in a wagon, and Leander and Adam as well, and they moved to Seattle, Washington, where Enoch had several years earlier sold the farm in Texas and moved to Seattle, Washington, where he was a peace officer in Seattle. So the families took off and went to Seattle. Now, Elijah, being a Scot and a stubborn Scot, and having no part in anything before he moved and homesteaded in 1883, refused to leave. So he took over at least Benjamin's homestead with the promise to gradually pay off the price of the homestead. And I believe he also took over Leander's homestead, though I can't absolutely swear to that. Adam's homestead was sold to someone else, and left the family. First it became a church camp, and first it became a CC camp and then a church camp, and now it's a little subdivision. But Elijah decided to stay here. He remained friends with the Coe brothers, who, in spite of being warned to leave the county, absolutely refused to do so a second time, and had enough friends and allies to back them up that though they sometimes suffered some pretty interesting accidents and tragedies, managed to stay on their ranch. And Elijah did pretty well for about 5 years there. And shortly after Benjamin and Martha left to go to Seattle, Uncle Henry was born. And a couple years later, Granddad was born. One fall, after the corn had been harvested and dried, and he loaded up the big wagon, put a team of horses to the head of it, and headed over on the Ruidoso River to Dowan's mill. Spent the night and waited for all the corn to be ground, and loaded the ground corn back into the wagon, and started home. And got to the Cree's Upper Meadow, or about there, we think, when he was executed. He was shot in the head. When he didn't get home the day he was supposed to, and he didn't come home the next day, Mother Peebles called some of the neighbors, and they went out searching for him. And they found him laying on top of the wagon, on top of the bags of ground corn. The horses wandering and grazing as they went. Of course, they reported it to the sheriff, but I have looked and looked and looked and looked, and cannot find any record whatsoever of any search or inquiry or investigation into how he was murdered. And certainly there was never any solution. Now, when I was in college, I used to stop on my way home from college in Alamogordo and have a glass of iced tea and go to the bathroom and visit for a little while with Aunt Lyda. And Aunt Lyda told me that after Grandpa Elijah's death, Mother Peebles made Uncle Henry and Granddad, well, no, not after his death. After Uncle Henry and Granddad got married and started having children, Mother Peebles made them promise that they would keep the family stories, like the murder of Grandpa Elijah, a couple of others, secret. That they simply wouldn't talk about any of the things that they knew and the stories that they had heard growing up, because she wanted the animosity, violence, and the tit for tat and the feuding to stop. And so Granddad and Uncle Henry never told us how Grandpa Elijah died. We were never told that Benjamin Lewis Breese was told to leave the county. We were never told that Leander was charged with murder when he was prospecting over in the Oregon Mountains. By the way, that charge was dropped because it was obviously false. But a lot of these stories we weren't told as children. And I'm not sure that even my father was told some of these stories. Aunt Lyda told me when I was in college about how Grandpa Elijah was killed. And some other stories, and explained some other happenings that I will talk about at other places that had mystified me until I sat down and talked with Aunt Lyda. I was so glad that she would be honest with me. Now, my grandmother kept her promise. She never told me these stories. We were told when I was growing up that Grandpa Elijah had a brain hemorrhage. When my grandmother died, I went with her lawyer over to the safety deposit box to take out the papers. And going through the papers, I found Grandpa Elijah's death certificate. And it did say on that death certificate that he died due to a hemorrhage of the brain caused by a gunshot wound. Now, my grandmother's lawyer was instructed to destroy all of those family papers like that had anything to do with violence or the Lincoln County War. So I'm certain that he did so. Unfortunately, because history was lost, and at this point, there is no feuding, there is no animosity, all of that stuff has died anyway. But it would certainly be nice to have that kind of thing in our family archives and in our family records. By the way, I think Wilbur Coe was the last Coe, at least in Lincoln County. But his grandchildren and nieces and nephews, the Bonnells and the Reynoldses, are still, I know the Bonnells for sure are still down at Glencoe, and the Reynoldses are all over Lincoln County. So, and of course the Peebleses are still here. You know who isn't here? No descendants of Murphy and no descendants of Dolan. Though they do make a big deal and have a little restaurant built over at Dolan House in Lincoln. And Murphy's big house still exists as a museum owned by the state because of its historical value. But none of their descendants are here, and I'm happy to say that I'm glad we outstayed them. I think I have a little bit of time left before I need to end for the day. So I'm going to share with you a story that happened to me that Aunt Lyda had to explain to me when I was in college. Now, we have this great, big, huge old barn. Some of it was built in 1883, 1884. Some of it was added onto in 1913. But it has an area where we used to store the sacked feed that we gave to the cattle. Daddy had a bobtail truck, and he would go down to Roswell to the feed mill where they took cottonseed and crushed it and got the germ out of the inside and made cotton meal, and then they pressed the meal into these little cakes called cottonseed cake. And it was very high in nutrition and just perfect as a supplemental food for the cattle. So Dad would take the bobtail truck down to the cotton in the meal yard, and bring back a load of 100-pound bags, burlap bags of cottonseed cake. And he would back up to the garage door, and he would throw one sack off, and Jim would grab both sides and drag it back to Granddad, and Granddad would stack it back in the area where we stacked the feed. And then Dad would throw another bag off, and I would grab that one, and I would pull that bag. And so Jim and I just took turns pulling these. No way we could lift them. We had to drag them back to Granddad. But we had a lot of fun, and it was a lot of competition doing it. And Marshall just couldn't wait until he was old enough to help. But there's no way, as little as he was, that he could have pulled one of those bags back there. So I'm pulling a bag back, and I put my foot down, and there was a weak board in the floor of the barn, and my foot went right through this floorboard. And I knew that the drop between the floorboard and the ground underneath that part of the barn should have been about 3 foot down. But my foot only sunk down about 6 inches or so. So I lifted my foot up, and I stomped, and I lifted my foot up, and I stomped, pulled the bag back, and I said, Granddad, there's something under the floor right there. I put my foot through that floorboard, and there's something underneath it. So right then and there, we stopped unloading the cottonseed cake, and Daddy went over to the shop and got a pry bar and a hammer, and came back, and they took up the floorboard. And lo and behold, under the floorboard, there was a trunk, a chest, had a humped back on it and everything. And I looked at that chest, and I thought, woohoo! A treasure chest. We're going to be rich. So Daddy and Granddad lifted this trunk out of underneath the floorboards and put the floorboard back and put it back over to the side and said, once we get the cottonseed cake unloaded, we'll open it and see what's in it. Oh, don't you know, Jim and I managed to get that cake drug back there twice as fast as we were going before, 'cause we couldn't wait to open that trunk and see all those gems and jewels and gold and all that pirate treasure. Now, I'm not sure how we figured there would be pirate treasure when there was no ocean anywhere near, but we were just absolutely sure it was a treasure chest. So we got the cottonseed cake unloaded, and Dad went over, and the trunk is locked. So he went and got the screwdriver and monkeyed with it for a little bit, and Granddad got some baling wire, and he monkeyed with it, and pretty soon it goes click, and it opens. And he threw back the lid, and it was full of books. And not just any kind of books. They were ledgers. They were the most boring thing. They didn't even have any pictures in them. And I was so disappointed. I said, oh, heck, I'm hungry. I'm going to go wash up for supper. So I went and washed up for supper and ate supper and went to bed. And about 2 o'clock the next morning, Dad came in and he said, Sis, I'm making a milk run to Carrizosa. Come with me. Sis, get up, wake up. Making the milk run to Carrizosa. Come with me. So I got up and I got dressed and I went out in the pickup, got in the pickup, and in the back of the pickup there were milk bottles and they had milk and cream and butter and eggs and stuff like that. We had a delivery route that once a week we would take over to Carrizosa and deliver milk and cream and eggs and butter and cheese and that kind of stuff to different people in Carrizosa. Some of them are relatives, and some people actually paid us by the month to deliver fresh milk and cream. Well, we did the milk run and dropped everything off, and on the way out of town, we pulled up in front of the courthouse, and Dad jumped out of the back of the pickup, and he took the trunk, he lifted it, set it on the courthouse steps, got in the pickup, off we went. Yeah, that was my treasure chest, the one that was full of books. He put on the courthouse steps. Off we went. Well, I didn't think anything of it, Okay, we didn't want the trunk. Maybe they could use those books at the courthouse. I didn't know. But I was telling Aunt Lyda this story when I was visiting her when I was in college, and she laughed, and she laughed, and she laughed. And she said, well, the next week, after you and your daddy dropped off that trunk, and she said, and till this day, I didn't know it was you and your daddy who dropped off that trunk, but I do remember the article in the newspaper saying that in the middle of the night, somebody had dropped off the missing Lincoln County courthouse records. They had been missing since 1913. Remember I told you the barn was added onto in 1913? Well, in 1912, New Mexico became a state. And in order to have a county seat, according to laws passed through Congress by the railroads, every county seat had to have a railroad running through it. So they were moving the county seat from Lincoln to Carrizosa. But Murphy didn't want to give up his power and having the county seat in Lincoln, and so he wouldn't give them the courthouse records. So one night, someone, don't know who, still don't know who, broke into the courthouse, which was the upstairs part of the big house, the Murphy Dolan store, stole the working courthouse records, and took them by horse to Carrizosa, and the rest of the records they loaded into a trunk, and those disappeared from 1913 till about 1959, 1960, when my foot went through the floorboard of the barn and hit that trunk. And Aunt Lida laughed so hard. She said she knows that the other records went up the Bonita Valley and across Nogales and into Carrizosa that way, and that they took the old records, the ones that were in the trunk, the old ledgers, put them in a wagon and hauled them in a different direction and took them up to Mother Peebles because they figured that a widow with just small children would never be suspected of harboring the courthouse records. And since the new part of the barn had just been newly made, I'm not even sure the floorboard was in. They put it there and put the floor over the top of it and conveniently forgot those records were even there until I found them. So that's the end of Murphy and Dolan was when the courthouse and the county seat was moved from Lincoln to Carrizozo, officially in 1912, but in actuality in 1913 when the records were stolen and moved at night. So, until next time, good night.